on this computer. We're recording. Start webinar. From webinar, I go to Facebook and click go live.
We are live.
I do see that. There we are.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
This is exciting. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today. So today we are going to be discussing disaster preparedness for refugees and new arrivals. My name is Robert Flores, and I am an attorney with YMCA International Services in Houston, Texas. I am also a fellow with Equal Justice Works Disaster Resiliency Program Fellow. I don't know how many people have gotten a chance to join us today. We're right at the 1 o'clock hour, so I'll give people just a little bit of time to come in and I'll introduce myself again. But today's discussion is part of a series of video broadcasts from different legal service providers during the month of March as part of the movement to create the Disaster Resiliency Awareness Month. The purpose of the Disaster Resiliency Awareness Month is to expand awareness about being prepared for a natural disaster and how to recover in case one is affected by a natural disaster. And part of that is understanding one's rights and what resources are available to them in the United States. So again, my name is Robert Flores, and I am an attorney and a fellow with Equal Justice Works Disaster Resiliency Program. Today, I am joined by Kimberly Haynes, Director of South Texas Office of Refugees, or STORE for short. STORE provides funding for local service agencies for a variety of supportive services for refugees, asylees, and other people admitted or paroled into the United States for humanitarian purposes, or for humanitarian reasons. So Kimberly, did I get all that right?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Awesome. So I've known Kimberly for a number of years. We've talked about overlapping cases sometimes, but this is our first official collaboration, which I'm really excited about. I hope you're excited too.
Absolutely. I think this is a really valuable and important topic to be raising, and I'm really excited to be able to be a part of it to help build some resources and materials to help those that are newcomers in our communities.
Excellent. So we'll get right into the discussion. We're just going to cover a variety of issues. Again, specifically, this is going to be tailored to what the refugee community needs to know, but also tailored to partner organizations, community organizations, and just other people who want to know more about other members of their community. So our hope is that we will be able to make this discussion available in different languages and with different accessibility as the video is published after today's date. So that's something we're definitely going to work on most likely together again. So, all right, so let's talk about the United States and disasters. So the United States
happen in the United States?
Yeah, it happens. So the United States covers obviously a huge geographic region, and within that, we are no strangers to disasters. We have wildfires, we have hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, droughts, blizzards, snowstorms. And I hear other parts of the United States have them too, not just Texas. So yes, just so you know, we are we are located in Texas. So, but of course, natural disasters are everywhere within the continental United States, as well as Alaska and Hawaii. And our refugee population also lives everywhere in the United States. So this is something that is incredibly important to know for the refugee community, but also just our community at large. And it's good to know how other members of our community deal with natural disasters. So let's start off with like the basic. So we have refugees and other new arrivals that come to the United States who are already fleeing country conditions based off, for the most part, man-made political disasters. And now they're coming to the United States and we're telling them, oh, now you have to worry about natural disasters. So let's just start off with the basics. So Kimberly, like, what is one of the biggest shocks that comes to refugees when it comes to disaster preparedness in the United States?
I think even the fundamental basics that there's a disaster, right? I mean, when you talk about refugees who have fled a multitude of impacts, these are usually human constructs, evolutionary issues that have occurred over time and slowly exacerbated the situation to make them flee and get out of the way and so forth. But when we're talking about disasters, a lot of the times we're talking about nature and nature overcoming our economic or our government constructs or our living environments and so forth that are not predictable and not necessarily always really clear on how it's going to impact us. And I think that does, just in its own right, sort of surprise refugees. I mean, when you're talking about a flood, some of these people have lived through annual floods. They know that it floods on a regular basis. So when we talk about a flood, it's like, oh, the roads are going to shut down, groceries, this, that, and the other. And it doesn't resonate that that's our disaster. That's a different, philosophy for them. So again, the word disaster means very different things to different people, and sort of explaining what we're talking about with refugees is unique and different. And so I think that that's one of them. I think the other thing is there's not a clear understanding of how federal and state partners, as well as nonprofits and nonprofit organizations, social service organizations, can help. But there's an assumption, right? We as United States citizens assume that our state and our federal partners will come and help support us through something. That's different than what happens in a lot of other countries when a disaster happens. You really are taking care of yourself and trying to figure it out, maybe with your community or neighbors, but not like as a whole government institution expressing that there is a way for them to help, whether that's food, manpower, water, or whatever. So again, helping explain that with that concept with our refugees is a really essential component, especially all those that do have legal status within these populations, because a lot of those supports they can get access to and they have a right to have access to. And that's sometimes really difficult for them to understand.
Yeah, and of course you mentioned the different levels of government. We have the federal, state, local, county, or parish, and it's just these levels of bureaucracy. And even for us who have lived here for a long time, it's sometimes so frustrating to see like the communication between all of those just being so disastrous, ironically. And that's, I think, something also so weird that maybe there's this perception of the United States being this like cohesive whole that can easily streamline services, when in reality, it's just like, no.
It is, because it is so overlaid, complicated, right? I mean, feds will say one thing, then that has to be interpreted or has to be funneled down. And each of those layers add a certain set of language or expectations or time frame. It's not always instantaneous. That's the other thing. Granted, a disaster happens and it happens right then, but the support or the help from the state or the parish or the county or whatever may take a couple of days, if not a week or two. And that's hard to figure out then who's doing what and who you can go to at what point in sort of the disaster situation.
So we have disasters. So what are the basics that the refugee and other new arrivals, the refugee community and other new arrivals need to know about being prepared? Like, where do we start?
Again, that's hard because again, that's multi-layered. What we, what disaster preparedness would recommend and what we would recommend is it's similar to like a safety plan. Every family that lives in a community or an area that may have normal natural disasters. So I'm just going to use Houston, right? Oklahoma has tornadoes, right? So we have hurricanes a lot. And so it really is sort of putting the reality that it could happen. And it's a likelihood. And this is what the word is. And this is usually what it means. And what is your family plan, right? So if something happens, how and in what manner who do you turn to? Who do you ask for help? And where are your key resources for support and assistance? If it's not like getting the information, maybe it's actually getting, food, water, shelter from, but to have a document that actually is your disaster preparedness plan for your family, but really simplified at this stage, because especially at the beginning, in the early time of their arrival, we don't want to over inundate them. We really want to try to narrow it down and talk to them about their community, who do they trust, who do they lean on when things are tough here in the United States, and try to really make sure that they have those people in contact when an emergency or a disaster is sort of identified. And making sure that they understand that there's a lot of information out there that isn't accurate, right? There's great people trying to do really positive things, but sometimes they don't have all the information. Sometimes they say things that aren't quite accurate, and that may scare somebody, or that may make people more fearful from asking for help. And so making sure that they aren't over reliant on maybe resources that aren't the best or the most competent in that moment in time to sort of give them information.
That's a great point, and it leads me into my next question, which is like, what are some of the difficulties in getting that information about disaster preparedness, and all of the obstacles faced by community organizations and getting that information out there to these communities? I mean, it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, it is very difficult. And again, good and bad, our modern technology has not always been helpful in that way, but in some it has. Gosh bless Houston, we have over 120 languages. We have a huge diversity of population, languages, capacity. It's a blessing and a curse at the same time, because it does make it hard for, like we said before, all the bureaucratic layers to get the material translated in a timely fashion for a specific community. And that's one step. And then it's getting it in the hands of the people in the community to make sure that they can see it. And again, that doesn't deal with literacy issues and disabilities and other kinds of things. And so that's, for me, why, creating some kind of disaster plan so that they could really pick up a phone and talk to a staff member at an agency, or they could talk to a caseworker and really ask, this is a disaster. What does exactly this mean? What might happen? Is really important. But language barriers is huge here. Access to good quality information is hard. Like we said, I think that technology's been really good, but sometimes people lean very heavily on their neighbors or on their friends, and they then don't necessarily have all the information that would be helpful for them. And so I think really making sure that they know where to look for that reliable information, and asking them for their opinion, right? Maybe it's their local church. So maybe we need to really focus to make sure that parishes or congregations have really good quality information. Maybe it's one specific news channel, but trying to make sure that they really know how to go and find the information and who to turn to if they don't know is really essential.
You mentioned, having a family plan, and the first thing that comes to my mind, I know when refugees come to the United States, they are often, the first place they live is an apartment complex, which, an agency has helped them get, and that comes with a rental contract. And there's so much great information in that rental contract about what their rights and obligations are. And that's one of the things that I think, that they should be aware of, as well as also knowing what benefits they would be aware of. Refugees and other new arrivals are coming with, a legal status or permission to be here in the United States, which affords them, the right to apply for certain benefits. And it's so important that that be a part of the family plan, that they know about this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a huge issue. We know that in our country, there's been some, rhetoric and language around people of status, of all kinds of statuses, and different opinions and thoughts about that, and whether they deserve or have access to the right to certain things. But there are absolute fundamental state and federal programs that people with status or their children who might have status, if they don't, that means they're afforded a right to ask for help, to get financials, to get support, to get food, to get water. And so making sure that they understand what is their status, what is their kid's status, and then what does that afford them in an emergency situation to go ask for help, right? Because again, after Hurricane Harvey, there was a lot of places that were standing up places to fill out FEMA requests and forms, but a lot of them didn't have Spanish language. A lot of them didn't have other kinds of translation language. And so they turned away people, and the people thought that meant they weren't eligible for that. And that wasn't the case. It was more about they had limited linguistic capacity. And so again, how do we make sure that those frontline people have linguistic capacity, and those clients really know, no, I can ask for this help. I need to find out how to communicate with you, but I can ask for this help, right? And so I think, that's a huge hurdle. And people are fearful that by asking for help in a disaster, it's going to impact their ability to adjust status at whatever time in their life they choose to. And the reality is it doesn't. A disaster is a disaster. It is hit everybody. It does not, if you need help, you need help. I needed help. I had a busted pipe. I had a flood in my house. It does not affect where you're headed in your future and where your citizenship or your status is going to go. And it really does, our environmental rhetoric over the past several years really has hurt and hindered people being willing to step up and ask for help. And that's a real horrible thing, especially in a disaster. It can really hurt you and your family.
It definitely is. When I speak with people, I get a lot of questions about, can I apply for this? For example, obviously the most, countrywide disaster we're dealing with right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm getting a lot of questions about, well, I don't want to apply for this because it'll affect my adjustment, or, and it's not just, it's all benefits, because it's not limited to food assistance or anything like that. It's also related to enforcing other rights that they have, maybe landlord-tenant rights or education rights. It's like there's this miscommunication and misinformation that says that if I apply for any kind of help, that means I'm being like a public charge, and they're not. These are emergency services that are needed in order for to be able to recover. In case you are hit with a natural disaster, which unfortunately in this country is incredibly likely.
Yeah, and I think again, you bring up the other thing is like labor rules, right? I mean, in natural disasters, good or bad, there's a lot of schemes that go around, and a lot of scrupulous individuals who try to take advantage of those who may not understand the system or may not understand the process, and really not having an entity to turn to ask questions and clarify, and not just blanketly trusting your neighbor or your community partner. We've seen some really rough situations where people were in the process of getting their FEMA money, and the FEMA money got taken by the neighbor, and then they never got the money, and now they're sort of stuck because now they've got to figure it out. And so that's why having an emergency preparedness plan, understanding your status, and really understanding those rights, so that you can feel empowered to protect yourself and your family and your property and your well-being, is so essential. I really sort of have seen that, and that's just a very disheartening situation that we've seen many of our clients in.
Definitely agree. I mean, on top of obviously the natural disaster of it, then we also have to worry about just all the people out there that just unfortunately try to take advantage of people who are struggling even more so. It's just really unfortunate. So we're here in Houston. So over the past couple years, we've had Hurricane Harvey. We've had a couple more floods. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic. Texas just went through a freeze, which was completely unprecedented, and no one here knew how to do anything. So, as working, with agencies and refugees, what have been your takeaways from those previous disasters, and what do you hope to take forward in order to be able to help our communities be more resilient?
I mean, definitely, a lot of the providers who work in the sphere and everything are trying to work better with the city to make sure that, again, information is linguistically translated appropriately for a multitude of populations, and also then how to get it out to their hands. But I think, one of the big things we have been starting to work on is how do we require sort of a disaster plan for all newcomers that go through our programming as a way to help the prevention. And we're starting to play with, creating business cards that have sort of disaster and sort of who to contact or who to call as a way to sort of help point people to reliable, trusting resources for which to understand. I think for those refugees who arrive from overseas and go through some of our programs, we're also trying to look at doing better cultural orientation. So really doing a course and a class and a conversation about what is disaster? Why do we call it disaster here in this country if it's a flood or if it's a freeze or if it's a, and really trying to educate them at the forefront of what their rights are as legal. And then also, when they see words like, oh, a disaster, they put it into some context, because again, we call it disaster and me and you might look at each other and go, okay, so I think something's coming, but it doesn't resonate always for other populations. And yet, if you were to actually call it a flood, I bet you'd have some population be like, oh, I know what a flood is, right? And so it's sort of like that context of where you come from, what your background is, what you've experienced, and you being able to layer that together and go, oh, okay, now I get what's going to happen here or what might be coming. Yeah, so I think those are things. I think, one of the things we're trying to figure out is how to get better. I think good and bad, our technology has increased quite a bit. And now we are seeing that I would say close to 85 to 95% of people do have smartphones. And so how do we create a simplified communication tool that will give them something in their language to try to point them to material and insight about what's happening. So, hey, 2 weeks before we think there's something coming that's around a freeze, let's send out a warning that says, hey, we think a freeze is coming. It's going to be called a disaster. Make sure you have your family disaster plan ready or whatever. And I think we're trying to think through ways to sort of do that for the population for whom we definitely have contact with.
And, part of that, it just can't come from us. It's going to be it has to be a collaborative effort, from the federal government, state government, local county. I mean, it's, these are government agencies which are entrusted to provide, this kind of awareness and protection to the community. And then it does include the refugee community and, our other immigrant communities who are, are here and, deserve the same information. So how do we, get them more engaged, or what can we do to, increase getting this awareness out?
I think like anything, the hard thing with disaster is that one disaster is never the same as another, right? So we lived through Harvey. We got a lot of learnings from Harvey. We did do better, but then we got hit with a pandemic and wow, that's a little different and it meant different things. And I think that's also acknowledging that sometimes we don't have all the information for preparedness, but how do we prepare people to sort of look for and sort of to engage in the conversation and to sort of spread the word as information sort of unfolds and as more details come out. I think, the concept of preparedness is be prepared to receive new information, be prepared to ask questions, be prepared that something could happen and how will you handle it? I think, there's a misnomer that we have an absolute playbook for disaster preparedness. There is no playbook. I've talked to FEMA, I've talked to international. Every disaster is uniquely and different. And how it affects your community, how it affects you, how it affects the larger city or the state or the country is different. So, for us, it is really about how do you get them to feel comfortable and confident to ask questions, to turn to people, and to know, okay, if I can't get to work, what do I do? Or if I can't have electricity, what do I do? Or if I don't have water, what do I do? And help get them comfortable with asking, right? Versus just the simplicity of suffering through it, which I think a lot of populations do out of their own isolation and fear and uncertainty. So those would be things that for me sort of, resonate. Is preparedness is also warning them of all the possibles and knowing that I can't tell you today that in 6 months we're going to get hit with a hurricane, your house is going to flood, and be prepared for that. It's not that easy to do.
It's not. And, you just mentioned isolation. A lot of refugee and new arrival communities are so isolated. So, just kind of like to round out the discussion, like what can community organizers do? And, how can community members, better interact with one another to be more aware of how to prepare, how to recover from a disaster? I mean, big question. I mean, probably has a simple answer. We just haven't thought of it.
We haven't figured out the perfect playbook and the perfect way to do this. Again, good or bad, I think a lot of cultures and a lot of multilingual communities and everything have a little bit to teach some of us. They are sometimes in more communion and more conversation and more integration with their own community than those of us that have been here all of our lives. And so I do think that there's something that they can teach us also about that community, right? What is that community circle? Who is sort of facilitating that community circle? Is it a group of people? Is it a subculture like a church group? Is it a group of people that work together that somehow commune in a multiple ways, right? Their families, their work environment, their church. And how do we make sure to try to keep one of each of those players in the conversation and sort of in the dialogue, because they don't sit behind a TV and just look at whatever the news channel is, or they don't sit behind their phone and just sit there. They've got, just like all of us, they've got jobs, they've got business, they've got things to take care of. They're busy people. And so whatever the spheres that they're interacting with need to be a part of that conversation and part of that information sharing. And I think that that's, just so essential. I don't know if we'll ever get an absolute, like, how to deal with it and what's the best way. I think we're slowly using technology to help get that facilitated. But I think there's a lot more to do to make sure that also organizations that have boards or have other groups that they're connected with, whether it's information gathering groups or practice sharing groups, how do you be the one to share it? I would rather get something 6 times than never get it at all. I can delete something or I can then share it out with my next group. And so if you're sharing, that helps sort of that information flow in different ways. And I know everyone's like, oh, duplication. But when it comes to a disaster, I'd rather duplicate the information.
You can't have enough. You really can. And I think my big takeaway is that, the 2 big important components or words that I'm going to kind of come at me are community and engagement. We just have to be there for one another. We have to understand that, we have to make things accessible. We have to engage with, people just outside of ourselves, have to engage outside of our own comfort levels, our own language, our own, cultural spheres. We just have to be more out there because we have to look out for one another, especially during a natural disaster.
Yeah, and I think, again, building on the preparedness is continuing to engage clients in knowing what are they engaged in, where are they engaged in, right? Because again, before the pandemic, we already had isolation and sort of separation, right? Whether it's cultural, whether it was linguistic, whether it was economics, it does drive people into their subset. Now you've added COVID, which now is supposed to be sort of this separation and social distance and isolation. And then you layer that upon a disaster and it continues to exacerbate sort of the situation. And so understanding who they reach out to for themselves for help. We don't always need to be the center point, but we want to know that they've got something, right? Either community, family, somebody, and how to just ask that question in dialogue with individuals I think is a huge step in that direction. I think we take it for granted that they know it or they already are it. And we just sort of attack certain issues. Like, here's water. Okay, great. Here, I give you water. That's it. But we don't really sort of suss out, how they're talking and how they're engaging so that we can get a better idea that they're not trying to just, I think, doing it alone.
I think today has hopefully been a great discussion. I hope we've definitely, enlightened our community members and our community partners. And I definitely hope that, we can collaborate in the future to, just help our community members so much more. So I think, we're at the half-hour mark, so obviously, but I definitely do want to thank you so much for being here. Again, I'm so excited that we finally officially got to collaborate on a project, and I hope we can definitely do more in the future. And again, I want to thank everyone who came out and joined us here for our part 2 in our disaster Resiliency Awareness Month. Our next discussion is going to be on March 9th, Disaster Survivor's Guide to SBA Loans. It will be by our Equal Justice Works alumni, Brittany Gomez at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, and our current fellow, Brianna Williams at the Community Legal Services of Mid-Florida. And they will discuss how small business administration loans can be used to help people after a disaster strikes. So we hope you can join us for that discussion as well. Kimberly, again, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate it.
I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to continuing to build on this work.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody, and we hope you have a great afternoon.
Take care, everybody. Be safe.